And I just want to I wouldn't do it justice when I introduce you. So Sam, if you could do the due diligence that you deserve to our listeners to let them know who they're listening to.
Yes, my name's Sam Quinones. I'm a journalist, reporter, writer, author. Written a lot about Mexico, lived for 10 years in Mexico, been doing this 35 years. Worked also after that 10 years for the Los Angeles Times, and I'm now a freelance writer, writing all kinds of stuff. But mostly what I've written in the last 10 years is the two books about our addiction epidemic, nationwide addiction epidemic. First book was Dreamland, as you said, which is about the opioid epidemic and pain pills and heroin and all that. And then the latest book is about the switch, in particularly in Mexican trafficking world, to away from plant-based drugs and towards synthetic chemical-only drugs, primarily fentanyl and methamphetamine. That's the least of us. True Tales of American Hope in the time of fentanyl and meth. And both of them really try to chart the path that as a country we've taken towards this very serious problem of addiction that is now far more pronounced than it's ever been and deadly than it's ever been in our history.
Yeah, so true. Well, I want to thank you for joining me this morning. I had read your book. It's been gosh, well, right when it was first published in 2015. And to be honest, I wouldn't say it changed my life, but it certainly did open up a different avenue for me when looking at my own hometown of Portsmouth, Ohio. Obviously I grew up there, and it's interesting because as I was reading the book, I was sort of going through all of my past history and my small moments in childhood, and going to although I didn't grow up going to Dreamland, but I did go to Dreamland for their swim dances. They had these infamous swim dances on Friday,
Right. Oh yeah.
night. And so every time I get the opportunity to talk to someone about my hometown, my people is what I call them, and my roots, I always bring up your book because I think it's such a important factor of a crossroads of where we are as a country today, even in 2022, going into 2023, but also where we've come from. I grew up there. I was born in 1980. And so it's interesting to sort of look at the evolution of where we've come in our society, and looking just back at the history, the rich history that I had and I know and my parents grew up with. My grandmother is still living. She's 103, still living in Wheelersburg, which is a county,
And
outside
there
of.
too.
Been there too. And it's interesting because when I read your book, I actually was a sales representative for Pfizer, and I was competing, sort of, you could call it competing, with the Purdue representative. So all of these names that you're mentioning, the Dr. Proctors of the world and the pill mills and the pain clinics, I was actually calling on professionally. And so as I was reading your book, and I hope that our listeners get to, if they haven't read your book yet, that they get to read your book and they go and they do their due diligence, because living through that process from, and being a sales rep from 2003 to 2006 in the Portsmouth area and Chillicothe area, I saw the tides changing in my hometown. And honestly, looking at it today, it's irrecognizable. Mitchell Lace was once a thriving, shoelace factory in the center, kind of a beacon like Dreamland was, is now a $30 million rehab facility.
Right.
And so it's interesting to sort of look at my hometown through your eyes. And I just would love for you to help me understand why you chose Portsmouth, Ohio, and give me the whole background about that.
Sure. It's important to understand for your listeners that Dreamland was a swimming pool, the size of the grounds of which were about the size of a football field, enormous thing. And it was a swimming pool in the town of Portsmouth, Ohio, your hometown, that's on the Ohio River, right across from Kentucky in southern Ohio, was once a bustling, thriving industrial town with steel mill, with numerous shoe manufacturers and shoelace manufacturers, as you say. a very active commercial downtown, and a largely working class to middle class town of about 50,000 people. Dreamland, this beautiful, luscious swimming pool that everybody who lived there remembers during those years, was really like the town square. It was a place where people came together, is where you grew up in public under the watchful eyes of not just your parents, but many parents who would correct you if you were out of line. The last thing you ever wanted to do was get out of line at Dreamland Pool, because you might get a band, and that's where the social life was from about May to October. It was an absolutely essential thing for that social life of that town. They did have those dances on Friday nights. I began to go to Portsmouth because I heard through several sources that it was where the pill mill business model became a big was invented. Essentially, the pill mills being essentially pain management clinics in name, but really what they were was an opportunity for doctors who were now sliding into corruption, frankly, of just prescribing endless amounts of these pills for cash. So every prescription was $250 cash, and the lines out the door every day were long. But this was a time much after the heyday of Portsmouth, which began to fall apart as a town with the Rust Belt phenomenon that took place in the late 70s into the 80s. Certainly, the steel mill left. The Walmart essentially sucked up all those commercial, locally owned small businesses on Main Street. Half the population leaves. The town essentially is reduced to about 25,000. And about 10 years into this economic devastation, the Dreamland pool closes and is dug up and is turned into what is now a strip mall, Chinese restaurant, a small market, a yogurt shop. The last I was there, that's what was there. Definitely not the great soul of the community that the swimming pool was. And a few years after that, just stripped of what kept the town together, come the opioids, the pain pills, the massive marketing, the very aggressive marketing, as you say, by Purdue Pharma and other companies, promoting the use of narcotic painkillers, opioid painkillers, as the solution to almost all pain. And it was like the arrival of a cloud of locusts. Both the sales reps were extraordinarily aggressive. Never before had there been such sales reps. In fact, drug sales reps for many years had been very kind of boring. Right? It was really, because you lived in the community. You were part of the community. You wanted doctors to trust you.
Yes.
You did not want to, but with the new sales force that came in, it was like, here today, gone in 9 months to another territory, and very aggressive promotion, very constant visitations, all this kind of stuff. And you began to see the emergence of the pill mill during these years. And these were doctors who may well have started out with the best of intentions, but being inundated with come-ons to use prescription painkillers far more aggressively. And also, it bears saying that a very intense pressure on the part of patients.
Yes.
Who, I need my pills, doc. And the idea that a doctor's appointment wasn't really an appointment if you didn't leave without a prescription. If you left without a prescription, you needed to have that prescription. That was part of why you went. And there was a readjusting of expectations, really, on the part of doctors and also on the part of health consumers, us Americans, that you needed to have that doctors would provide miracle cures, in a sense, that when doctors would say, you don't need these pills. What you need is to get in shape, is to eat better, walk more, swim, get lots of exercise, and take accountability for your own wellness. Americans in general pushed back that was also part of this. I really came to believe, to push back against this idea, like, no, doc, you fix me, give me my miracle cure. And this began the pill mill idea, where you're just, a doctor's there just to dispense prescriptions with almost no pain analysis or diagnosis or thought about how you might address this in a different way. It was just about pills. That began in Portsmouth, Ohio. Dr. Proctor, David Proctor, who's now dead, but as you mentioned, he was really the first one. Then he begins to farm out his practice to all kinds of, really by then, scandalous doctors who came from all over the country, many with addiction problems of their own. They then start up their own pain clinics. He was known as the Ray Kroc of the pain medicine, referring to the guy who kind of made McDonald's into an enormous franchise. And so all of this happened in Portsmouth first, and that's why I went there. I really went there to tell that story, and it's definitely a story I could tell. And I would sit in there was a sober clubhouse by the time I arrived, which was 2013 for the first time, 13 and 14. In fact, I was planning on going there twice for about 3 days each.
Okay.
And then I realized as I got there that I really needed to dig down much deeper into Portsmouth, Ohio. And I ended up going 6 times, each time for about 5 to 7 for a week, roughly each time. But I learned about the most scandalous parts of this story from just sitting in the sober clubhouse, and people would come who were in recovery from their pill addiction, and they would sit in the sober clubhouse. It's right there on 52 near what's the pizzeria? Giovanni's Pizzeria.
There's the Giovanni's, yes.
Giovanni's right there, not too far from there, right like a block or two away. And I would listen to their stories, and I would talk for hours at a time, sometimes 3-4 hours a day, listen to the war stories of going to guys who would go to these doctors. And, it was the most shameful thing sometimes, a complete a corruption of what a pain management clinic ought to be. Some were held in houses with waiting chairs outside in the yard. And I mean, there was no attempt to really turn this into a real pain management clinic where you're given actual opportunities to treat your pain. Nobody wanted that. The doctor didn't want that. The patients didn't want that. But it all takes place against the backdrop of a hollowing out of the town of Portsmouth, Ohio. Jobs, people, places to see each other. After Dreamland closes, the only place you really were able to see other people is at Walmart. Hey, how you doing as you're passing in
and
lunch?
Just so you know, that's still the case today. I was just back there for Thanksgiving, and that's still the very much the same thing. Or Friday Night Lights, which is a football game or a basketball game, which is, that's Friday Night Lights.
I would say though that we can talk about this later, but one of the beautiful things about Portsmouth though is that is also changing too. They now have, I took to be one of the great moments in Portsmouth rebirth to the degree that it's happening, and I think it's an important story, as important as the decline, is that you now have 2 cafes, outdoor cafes where people can meet. And I take out independent cafes to be really a sign of economic resurgence. I'm not talking about the Starbucks by the interstate. I'm talking about someplace in town where people come together. So you have the Lofts Cafe, and you have the other one over in the Boney Fiddle area. I can't remember its name. They're going to hit
Market Street.
There you go, that one. And these are great things. These are masquerading as small cafes, but they're really a place for people to come together, do work together. Economic vitality is born many times in these small cafes. There's a whole bunch of other signs of resurgence that we could talk about in Portsmouth, maybe get to later. But when I was there, it was kind of, I got there, I spent a lot of time there in 2013 and 14. And when the first time I arrived in Portsmouth, I saw none of that. It was very, very much a scary place, wondering if this was really my country. I got lost on Portsmouth's east side the first day And I was wandering around, driving around going, oh my God, where the hell am I? Saw people in cars who were clearly high and almost zombies, it felt to me. And you began, I saw this town with the eyes of a newcomer, thinking, oh my God, this is horrible. I would say that as time passed, and as I spent more and more time there, I ended up spending like I would say somewhere close to certainly 6 weeks, maybe 2 months there. Eventually, in total, I began to see the resurgence, the rebirth of the town. But the first time I was there was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And I had several people who were especially important in explaining the town to me. One was Lisa Roberts, at the city's public health department. She's very thoughtful, very articulate, smart lady. Ed Hughes, too, who is at the counseling center, now retired. He was fantastic. There's a bunch of folks who really were able to explain Portsmouth in the context of a much larger phenomenon of this massive promotion of pain pills, the revolution in pain in opioids, the opioid revolution in pain management in America is generally how I see that, where you find people who are just doctors and pharma companies who are promoting the hell out of these pills, saying these are the new miracle cures for all our pain, and no one will get addicted. If you're a pain patient, you're in pain, you will not get addicted. Of course, that was nonsense.
Right.
Proved
Well,
to be
I mean, but
completely wrong.
that was perfect marketing, right? You can take a pill, you can feel better instantly, and then you can, all the pain and everything is gone. And it's interesting to hear that from your perspective, because being in that selling environment and being ultra competitive in that environment for pain management, like you were talking about, you were drawing a really good visual. I can tell you, even just being in that environment, working there, driving around, trying to track down these pill mills, because I would get, data within my computer system to go and find these people, talk to these physicians, because it's interesting. I think what a lot of our listeners don't understand is how, when we talk about healthcare and looking at our, why the system worked the way it did, is there were no checks and balances. We had physicians who were coming in and they were setting up these clinics. You're 100% correct, in homes. And they would write these prescriptions for cash. And I would pull into a parking lot and I would see
long lines,
25 cars with entire families sitting in them for hours at a time. And then I would leave at the end of the day and go to drive to my apartment in Chillicothe and see, them still sitting there off of Highway 23 in these random homes, still after 6 and 7 o'clock at night, waiting on their prescriptions. And what a lot of people don't understand is, this became not only a sense of like, getting rid of your pain and feeling better, but it was also a business on that side, because Ohio Medicaid was allowing these prescriptions to be filled. And then it became a business for these people, because if they did, it was $10 a milligram.
Right.
So on the other side, seeing all of this, I had a non-opioid, I had just an anti-inflammatory. So I wasn't even in the ballpark of winning any awards trying to compete with this. And I was not on Ohio Medicaid. But when you have sort of, it was the perfect storm, Sam.
Right. No, there's absolutely, what was going on was all these pressures being put on doctors. And so you had the drug companies, pain specialists were saying, this is how we need to treat pain from now on, right? So a primary care doc, a family doc who really didn't know much about pain management would say, okay, this is how you do it in medicine. You learn from the experts. The experts are saying this is the way we do it now. That's weird because it's contrary. When I learned in medicine is you stay away from opioids except for in certain very defined, well-defined limits and times, like end of life care, post-surgical care for a couple of days, 3 days, whatever.
Yes, absolutely.
Hospice, all that. But now it became almost anything, chronic pain, and anybody. So So any injury, so all of a sudden football becomes a gateway to heroin addiction because kids are provided these pills in enormous amounts, get addicted to those pills, can't afford them eventually because the doctor may cut them off or something like that, and they switch to the street, buying them on the street, which is $1 a milligram. You can't afford that if you're doing 200 milligrams a day. And so eventually people began to switch to heroin. This began to happen by the time I was onto this story. This was happening all over the country. The important part of all this, Lindsay, I think, is that it was a national story. What was happening in Portsmouth was a snapshot, a small snapshot, but this was not just Portsmouth. This was everywhere. Yeah. This was suburban Indianapolis. This was Portland, Reno, all over the Southwest, all over the South. It was everywhere because it was doctors as a class, as a group, were badgered, convinced, pushed, cajoled. Some went very willingly into this new prescribing paradigm. Others went kicking and screaming. Some never really did. But whatever the case, you saw doctors nationwide get with the program beginning in the mid-90s, and certainly by the 2000s, you began to see this as like taught in medical school is how do you deal with pain? Endless amounts of opioids for whatever. I was just speaking with a doctor here in Tennessee where I'm living now, and the numbers of cases. One woman we both know was given Vicodin for a foot rash, for goodness sakes, a foot rash. There's nobody has any business prescribing anything like an opioid for a foot rash, but that was 20 years ago. That's how people were thinking. And what it bears mentioning too, that some people definitely helped. And I think particularly people in chronic pain, older people in the 70s or 80s with arthritis, definitely helped by this. But there was a huge collateral damage nationwide to this. It created an enormous new population of opioid addicted Americans that then became eventually some of those, and I would say a significant number, not sure how many ever, but became a market for heroin coming up from Mexico. Right. Eventually, that's what happened.
So let me ask this. So, you wrote this book in 2015, and now you have a follow-up book and wrote The Least of Us in 2021. Right before we got on this podcast, we were discussing just a mutual friend, one that I grew up with. He was on, I did a 2-part series with Dale King talking about the opioid crises, and you had discussed, and you and I were discussing the changing of what Portsmouth looks like now. And I attribute a lot of that to people my age, late 30s, early 40s, who are living there, maybe grew up there, most likely grew up there. That sense of community is certainly coming back. The tides are changing. And I attribute that to a lot of people like Dale and so many people who want to bring Portsmouth, Ohio back. And with that being said, as Portsmouth is sort of slowly rising and redefining who or what that community looks like, you write this book, The Least of Us. You feature Dale in the last chapter, you said, of this book. And now we've seen a new rise of opioid addiction from a different perspective. And to be honest, Sam, when I was talking to Dale about, how far we've come, we're still losing people, hundreds. Sure. And the numbers are still there. So even though we have a totally different idea and concept of opioids and the addiction, we can look at, obviously COVID wasn't helpful, but we're in 2022 and we've looked at, now of course, JD Vance, Hillbilly Elegy, that's his background. He's drawn a huge platform for opioid addiction and just his background. He's now our Ohio U.S. Senator. So we're still, even though we've come so far, we are still in a sort of the same place that we were when we wrote the book.
Well, I would say we're both better off and worse off than when I wrote the book. And I'll say this, just charting back a little bit. When I wrote Dreamland, other than in Portsmouth, I was having a horrible time finding families with addicted loved ones who wanted to talk publicly about that. And that was a great concern to me. I did not realize that I would encounter that when I started the book. I thought everybody would be happy to talk about it. And that's not the case. People were mortified. They were ashamed at how their loved one, their kid, their spouse their grandparents sometimes, you know what I mean? I got strung out on this stuff and then switched to heroin and then relapsed and died and all this different
The
stuff.
stigma was very real. And when you
It
come
was
from a
very
small,
real.
well, and think about it. There's a lot of small towns, communities that sort of make up that Portsmouth area. And where I come from, you don't talk about your business outside of the home. And you don't want other people, because that's, you know, you're sharing your dirty laundry. That just wasn't something you discussed.
No, and I think that what happened was that allowed that conspiracy of silence that was not just in your area, it was nationwide. I mean, I was traveling to many towns across the country, and I could find very few families who wanted to talk about this publicly. That kind of silence allowed it to spread further because nobody knew what to do once their loved one got addicted to these pills. And so they suffered in silence. And then when the person would die, it would be like a lifetime of just agony and misery because you couldn't talk about it. You didn't know what happened, really. You'd look back and go, what just happened to my life, to our family life? As a reporter, I thought this was very alarming because the only way you are able to really tell the story is through the people who can tell it most poignantly, and that is family members. And I found five. I mean, I found five, that's all. And it was just, think of thousands and thousands of families affected. What happened, though, after Dreamland comes out was a stunning thing for us in my house. Because I told my wife, this book's never going to sell. No one wants to talk about this. Nobody wants to talk. The politicians aren't really aware. The media covers it in a very haphazard manner. And so I'm going to be on to writing another book within 6 months. And what began to happen, though, comes out in 2015, April 2015, and then in paperback in 2016. I began to see this just gradual emergence of awareness. All those families who were in darkness, more and more and more of them with every year step into the light, begin to start telling their story. I could not believe what I was seeing. There were 3 lawsuits. When I finished Dreamland, there were 3 lawsuits against drug companies at that time when I turned in my manuscript. Within a couple of years, I think maybe 2, maybe 3 years, there were 2,600. You're talking about tribes, cities, counties, and then eventually attorneys general. And the attorneys general come with subpoena power and very experienced investigators and attorneys who are used to prosecuting consumer cases. And so you begin to see every attorney general in America do this. And all of a sudden you begin to see all this new information that I, as a lowly, independent, lonely, a freelance writer could never have gotten access to. And that was by 2018, 19, you're seeing absolutely. But I was then asked to give all these speeches all over. I came to Portsmouth again. I spoke in Chillicothe. I spoke in Columbus, but also Wisconsin and Hawaii and Vermont and, Nevada, et cetera, all over the country. And that's where I began to
give them a voice, Sam. You empowered them. You wrote their story down in words, and you allowed them the ability to step out and say, this is my story, but there are millions of stories just like yours.
I think so many people
didn't die in vain.
Yeah, I think so many people felt so alone until then. They felt like we're the only one in 10-mile radius. And what they come to understand is there's probably 5 families like us in the church that I go to, or there's 3 more on my street. You know what I mean? It was that widespread. So what ends up happening because of all this new energy, I consider that to be one of the great grassroots political movements of our time, except for it's never recognized as such because it's not organized. There's no union. There's no press secretary. There's no president of the association. It's just people coming out. But what ends up happening is more and more you begin to see politicians take notice, budgets change priorities, you begin to see new policies, and you begin to see these lawsuits. And that means that by 2019, we are seeing a totally different energy. When I wrote Dreamland, the subtitle to the book, it was a barometer of this. The subtitle of the book was True Tale of America's Opiate Epidemic. I didn't use opioid because no one knew what an opioid. If you weren't involved in medicine, you had no idea what I was talking about. So I put opiate because people know what that is. But now, of course, everybody knows. Everybody knows how to pronounce the word naloxone. right? I mean, that was not the case. You know, there were no lawsuits. Now you began to see this total rethinking of priorities. You begin to think all kinds of new things were now considered to be, you know, acceptable, politically acceptable. You see people in red areas proposing criminal justice reform, which would never have been possible 10 years earlier. That was just completely impossible to imagine. And you see unbelievable change.
Well, you
Then,
see it from an addiction level. I mean, just looking at addiction and where, like you were saying, you could only get 5 families. We look at mental health now, and you change the game, Sam.
yeah.
We look at mental health, and, you know, COVID allowed that as well, but just looking at addiction and saying, you know, this is something that every single person can be affected by and has in some way been affected by it. You change that.
Thank you. Well, it may have had a lot to do with it. I don't know. I mean, I know that I can tell you this. This is what I can say. There was one way that this epidemic was viewed before my book was published. And it was before Dreamland, and there was a totally different way that developed after Dreamland. And I know that because I lived it firsthand. I lived it every day, literally almost every day, trying to find new people to talk to who wouldn't want to talk. And then later, it's like I was meeting people at every place I spoke. I remember there was about a 2-year period. I remember meeting almost every place I spoke. I would meet somebody who would come up and tell me his or her story. And I thought to myself, damn, if I'd known that person when I was writing Dreamland, I'd have put them in the book because it's such a powerful story. But I wasn't me. Nobody wanted to tell that story back then, you know?
Of course not. Well, and so now you have book number 2, The Least of Us.
Right.
And you said in some instances we're better and some instances we're worse.
And I would say we're better because of this emergence into the light of all these people now telling their stories, families, and that has created a brand new awareness that did not exist when I was. The way in which we are worse is that the source of the supply has changed from doctors and drug companies to the Mexican trafficking world. And this has also happened at a very time when the Mexican trafficking world has done its own evolution away from plant-based drugs and towards synthetics, which are drugs made only with chemicals. And of course, the 2 most important of those, perhaps really the only ones we're talking about, is fentanyl and methamphetamine. And they are not so easily brought into line as a wayward doctor. A wayward doctor can very easily be prosecuted. A lot of people live in terror. Doctors live in terror of being prosecuted. They're very quick to change, probably change too much. Went from prescribing all kinds of pills to none at all. And I think that's a mistake too, because these pills have very important role in making the lives better for a lot of people.
Used properly in the right and the appropriate setting for the right indications. Absolutely.
And we're not given endless refills based on like a hunch, you know, like, oh, sure, come on in.
And just so you know, I mean, and you can attribute this, the Ohio laws, and I'm sure other state laws have changed because of you and your book. And there are pill counts now that are in effect. If you go to CVS, you can't get another prescription at Rite Aid, and then you can't go to Walmart, and there's days and there's limits and there's amounts, and whether or not people agree with that or not, there is now a system in place that we have that we didn't have before.
Right. No, I think all of that has happened in the last few years. Some states coming much sooner, some states coming into it around then. But you're absolutely right. You're seeing a whole bunch of new policies and new budget, and now all this money dislodged from various companies like Purdue, like Walmart and Walgreens and CVS, like many of the drug distributors, which are, you know, I'm in Tennessee. They stand to get eventually close to $1 billion from. I can tell you, when I was walking around the bottoms of Lucasville in 2013, I thought to myself, there is no chance that these companies will ever be held to account, because I was looking around at the bottoms of Lucasville, which is a place of, you know, lots of trailer homes, cars up on blocks and everything. And I was thinking, these folks have no voice. They would make lousy plaintiffs. They've already ripped off their child's Christmas presents, gone to jail, done this, done that. And there's no way that there's ever going to be plaintiffs sympathetic enough to allow a jury to find in the favor of them instead of the companies. There's just too much money, too much power, and these folks are voiceless. And now I remember thinking about those times in the bottoms of Lucasville and the east side of Portsmouth, when I began to see these multi-billion-dollar settlements. I just couldn't believe how much money, because I definitely never imagined this would ever happen. Then the problem is now that we have that the underworld in Mexico has taken over the supply, and the drugs that they are making, again, making, not growing,
Right.
are in such quantities, stunning, staggering quantities, because they have access to, they control 2 shipping ports, major shipping ports through which all kinds of products come, but through those ports, they can get chemical ingredients to make all the drugs they'd ever want. Methamphetamine and fentanyl, and they are very, very adept at smuggling. And we have a free trade agreement with Mexico and a 2,000-mile border. Most of this is not, by the way, it's very important to understand, most of this is not coming on the backs of people. It's coming in trucks through with other products, and it's just coming through in staggering quantities, because that's how much they can make down there, and they are making. And so they have covered the entire United States. This is an unprecedented thing.
When I read your book, Sam, I was astonished on how well run of a business this truly is. The marketing, the planning of standing outside of all of these clinics, they were salaried employees, that you could consider them now Uber drivers at this point.
Yeah.
The amount of just thought and the process behind how these drugs got into our country then, and looking at it now, you're exactly
right. I say that from Dreamland to the least of us, that has reached an entirely different level, beside other than beyond the reach of the guys that I wrote about in Dreamland, from this one town in Mexico who had this system, this retail system of selling retail amounts of black tar heroin, like pizzas, basically essentially similar to a pizza delivery system, with an operator dispatching a driver to go give you your heroin, that kind of thing. And that system, from this one village, that system, they'd spread it to 25 states is what I eventually counted. And certainly Ohio was a big one, was one of the most important, because they came first to Columbus in 1998. They realized one guy in particular understood that by coming to Columbus and seeing the pills, seeing OxyContin, which he'd never seen before, he began to think, if I just follow the pills, these new opioid things that these doctors are so aggressively prescribing, I'm going to have a heroin market before too long. And that was really the thinking of those guys for a long time, that you just follow the pills. So you go to Nashville and Indianapolis and Charlotte and South Carolina, various places in South Carolina, Lexington, Cincinnati, Kentucky, Louisville, et cetera. All these different places, you're going to have brand new markets. You don't have to use a gun at all. It's brand new. There's no competition. What ends up happening, though, is that with the changes in the trafficking world down in Mexico, and the move away from poppies and away from marijuana and all that towards meth and fentanyl, it's an explosion. Now there's the guys that I wrote about in Dreamland almost don't matter anymore. They're there, they're still working, but they don't really matter, because now they were big fish in a small pond, and now that pond is an ocean, and they're just the small fish they always really were. And now the pond is enormous. Everybody's involved up here as well as down there, and so you get just a geometrically expanded market. The problem is, of course, that these drugs are devastating in 2 ways. Fentanyl, of course, is deadly, the deadliest drug we've ever seen. Methamphetamine is now, I think what's happening is that it's now made in such a pure, potent way that is creating, the human brain cannot handle how potent it is, and it's creating psychosis, symptoms of schizophrenia, and in time homelessness and tent encampments go along with this, wherever it goes. And now, as I say, it's all the way up into New England, which was never had any meth to speak of. Vermont, Massachusetts, they've never had any methamphetamine. Got rid of all those little shake and bakers that you had in Ohio and Indiana and various places. Those guys making meth in their trunk of their car in a motel or in a barn. Those guys don't exist. They were outcompeted, like what Walmart did to Main Street. That's what this meth did to all those little shake and bakers that you might remember from like 8-10 years ago that were, you know, exploding labs. And that's why you can't buy Sudafed pills over the counter anymore. You got to have a, you know, a lock and key and all that. However, I would say this, and this is the focus of my latest book, The Least of Us. That what I began to do, that's a very dire scenario I just painted, and it is. I don't like blink in these things. You got to write what
necessary.
You got to write what's true. I would, however, one of the things that really, and this is what brought me back to Portsmouth. One of the ideas that I had was, I believe we got into this because we were looking for magic answers. So what's to complicated problems? What's the complicated problem? Human pain derived from the central nervous system. What's the magic answer? One kind of pill, one kind of drug for every single human being out there. That doesn't work, didn't work. What I believe is necessary is focusing on the small stuff, the small steps towards economic development, towards community strengthening and repair. And that's why I used Portsmouth for the last chapter of my book, because I believe that is what's going on in Portsmouth. It is not sexy. It's not like, you know, blowing the hinges off everything and the roof up. It's not solving every problem. It's a bunch of people like Dale King, like, you know, Tim Wolf and all these different folks that are out there coming together, using their own energies, their own desires, and their own talents to kind of mix a gradual movement towards something better. It does not change the fact that there are lots of drugs in Portsmouth. It does not change the fact that there's not a whole lot of really well-paying jobs in Portsmouth. It just is simply adding a narrative. And so you see Dale with, I can't remember, 3-4 businesses, one of which very importantly, and these are all small businesses, like the days are over when, like in the heyday of Portsmouth, they'd have a factory open, 250 jobs, they'd splash it all over the headlines. Oh, isn't this great? Those days are over. Any factory that comes like that is going to be mostly robots anyway. You know, and so it's the small stuff where you've got you and 3 employees or 2 employees, you and 5 employees using that raw material which is a recovering addict. The recovering addict is very much like fossil fuel. You had decay. From decay comes energy. A person who's like energetic now instead of looking to rip off the copper wire and all that stuff. You know what I mean? And you've got 4 CrossFits. Last I saw there were 4 CrossFits. That is the very symbol of community rebirth, right? People working out together, not alone, together, doing the jump rope and doing the weights.
Not hiding.
No.
Showing up.
And many people actively, a recovery community, people in 12-step meetings, all these kinds of things. Dale's part of that essential kind of synergy, that fusion of energies.
Yes.
That I think is really the idea behind my latest book, which is to say that it's through community rebirth and repair and strengthening, which we've done so much to shred. Yes. You know, the last 40 years, we have shredded community in a million ways. We could go on and on talking about how we've done that. But to my way of thinking, these epidemics of addiction, pain pills, heroin, now fentanyl and meth, et cetera, combined with all the other addictive stuff that's out there, right? It's legal. Pornography, gambling, video games, social media, sugar, fast food, et cetera. All of that stuff is like arrayed against us. What is our defense? Against fentanyl, against sugar, against pornography. It's finding common ground with people, building together. And when you do that, you begin to see that solutions become more possible than they were when you were all alone working, you know, trying to figure out, gee, how do I solve this? And it's also saying, you know, we have this, for example, this horrible problem with foster children and, you know, too many foster kids and all that. How do we solve the foster children system? Well, maybe the best way to do is think about, well, as I say, as a church, maybe you take one foster kid or two, one at a time, small scale stuff, working towards them larger scale and solutions. And to me, Portsmouth today was so manifested that stuff so clearly. And that's why I went back to Portsmouth and did my last chapter in the book on that specifically.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, all these things that you're talking about, there's just so much hope in hearing you say that. And, you know, I want to commend you because even going back to that platform and you saying just the 5 families that would speak to you, you know, now and bringing, you know, Dale back into giving him credit, you know, although there's lots of people in my hometown, but because I just interviewed him, I think it's important to point out he was just on the Kelly Clarkson show. And he is bringing a new spotlight, and they're trying to sort of shop a hometown movie to look at and honor what has happened in the Portsmouth, Ohio area. And your new book, The Least of Us, you said you dedicated that to Portsmouth and you're bringing this sort of community. When I talk about, and when we first, you and I just got on Zoom, I was talking about my people. I left Portsmouth in 2000 and actually 1999 when I left for college. I did go back there, work several years for a pharmaceutical company. And then Cincinnati is now my home. But it's interesting because I still say back home or my people. And even my children say, Mom, back home, we're our home. You know, Cincinnati is home to them and to us. But that sense of community, that's something that I want for my own kids.
Sure.
And it can't
everybody does.
Yes. And it can't,
everybody does.
You can't duplicate that. You can't duplicate what sort of that sense of what you're talking about, enmeshment and people and community and what happens in those sort of environments. It can't be duplicated unless people really do put themselves out there and allow that to happen.
What I think needs to happen is what used to happen very naturally. You know, when I was growing up in Southern California, we never were indoors. I mean, it had to be pouring rain for us to be indoors. It was great weather. By 3:30, 4 o'clock every afternoon, there'd be clumps of kids and the park was packed. Now that same street completely empty. The park, I don't even know why they maintain it anymore because there's nobody ever uses it. What we need to do, and I think this is really getting back to this whole idea of trying the small stuff, is we need to be intentional about stuff. Right? We need to say, we are going to plan a barbecue, a block party. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And we're going to work at it until it becomes part of almost second nature. Because here's the thing, what you were saying, everybody wants that. Everybody in America wants that. We've just lost practice. Yeah. Used to be that, you know, you knew to come home when the street lights went on, but now nobody's outside and all the kids are like afraid to go outside. First of all, they're like attached to their screens, but also nobody else is outside. So why should I go outside? You know, why should I go out to play when nobody else is out there too? And so I think we really need to be intentional. You need to plan these things. And I think that's a little bit what's going on in Portsmouth. I went back to Portsmouth for just before Christmas 2018 because they had set up an enormous temporary ice skating rink. And I just wanted to write about.
Yes.
Right, exactly. That's part of the book. That's part of the last chapter of my latest book, because I wanted to see a community doing the small stuff. That's a small thing, but it actually helps bring people out of their shell now, COVID was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster because it cut back on all of that. And it at the very time when the trafficking world out of Mexico had succeeded in covering the country with these 2 extraordinarily toxic, damaging drugs. So we need to build our way back out of that now that COVID seems to be in retreat to some degree. And that means just getting out there more, getting out and being around other people more, not accepting that it's a good idea just to be alone in your house all the time. And that is really kind of the beginnings of the solutions, plural,
right,
to this whole problem. But again, that's why I went back to Portsmouth. I think what's happening there is fascinating, is so exciting. It's a great American story. It's just not magical. Like there's no like, silver bullet magic wand. It takes a long time and it's small steps, and you wouldn't see it if you don't have some historical perspective to compare it to like 3 years ago, 8 years ago, 20 years ago. You know what I mean? That all of that to me is really the essential part of all this. And that was the idea. Behind the idea was the title, "The Least of Us." I'm not a Christian, but I was reading the Bible during writing this book, kind of almost like as a guide, trying to find a guide for how the book might read. And it came upon Book of Matthew. "That what you do for the least of these, my brethren, you do to me." And that's what Jesus said. And I thought to myself, yes, that's part of it. It's this idea that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable, only as strong as the least of us. But I also thought of it in terms of the least little, effort, the smallest, unnoticed, least sexy effort towards building a community is where we have to be focused now, not thinking that there's no, as Dale said in his, I think it is painted on his wall somewhere, which says, "Nobody's coming." I thought that was brilliant. I put that in the book. Nobody's coming, right? It's just up to you. It's just up to you. And I think that's a very, very healthy attitude to take. No one's going to come in and step in and do it for you. But the truth is, there's so much dormant talent and energy in most American towns that I don't think you probably need much more than that. Sure, you need some funding. Sure, you need this, that. You need some grants here and there. You need the colleges and the universities to step up. Churches definitely have a huge role to play in all this. But you've got that. And so that's possible. You just have to readjust. You get used to the small steps.
Yes.
And not be discouraged when you have not solved all the world's problems.
Everybody loves a good comeback story. Who
Oh,
doesn't love a good comeback story? I think that's part of it. That's part of when you were talking about what's happening in Portsmouth, it's fascinating. I totally agree with you. I'm, at the edge of my seat wondering what does my hometown look like in 20 years from now, when I want to actually go back and drive through downtown again, as opposed to taking the new bypass just to get to my grandmother's to visit her and then leave. I want to know what that looks like. So, I sort of you too.
Yeah.
So is that book number 3? What's in for you moving forward?
I'm pretty exhausted right now. I'm not sure I'm thinking about any book. I'm thinking more about like taking a nap, honestly, God. But to me, this is the thing about this topic. I thought when I had started Dreamland that I was writing kind of a crime story, like a story about heroin promotion, heroin marketing, and prescription pain pill marketing. And that's certainly part of the story. But as time went on, I began to realize this is really about America. You could go on forever. This allows you opportunities to write about America in very broad ways, like economic development or devastation, community solidarity or fragmentation. All of this can be written about from the perspective of our addiction issues that we've been wrangling with in unprecedented ways since the late 90s.
It's so interesting, Sam, because I've interviewed quite a few people. I recently ran for state legislature here in Ohio, in the Cincinnati Hamilton County area, wanting to make a difference. Like, that's what it's all about, is stepping into the uncomfortable to try to make just small steps, whether it's legislation or whatever it may be. And it's interesting because when you're talking about the isolation and where we've come, just everyone so far from that community perspective, where the village is now, we've we only take care of our own. And I think from a hope perspective, with you giving everyone the platform and these families to start talking about that and taking these small steps, that maybe that next book, when you go back to Portsmouth, you see that sense of community, and you see that sense of people stepping out and really embracing other people. You know, the overlying tone that I think all of us have heard within the last several years at least is divisive. And that's
Yeah.
the word that I've gotten over and over and over, especially, you know, sort of dabbling in the political scene here within the last couple of years, um, divisive. And I can't get past sort of this human perspective that we all have to have, is that there is still a sense of community. We all have a broader base, a broader sort of vision. We all are Americans, and we have this problem. And in sort of fighting each other, we have
Yeah.
to embrace each
But
other.
see, all of this is the dope talking. Okay. If you listen to CNN or Fox News, what are the overriding themes and messages of CNN and Fox News? It's pointless because everybody's too divided. There's no real solution, except for if those other people would just think better, if they would be better human beings. And that's the fundamental idea, which is the fundamental message of Fox News and CNN is, you're right. Not that they're wrong, but they're bad. You're right, they're bad. And that does not lead to any kind of but if you get down onto the ground and you get away from some of these more toxic issues that tend to be that Fox News and CNN tend to prey on, and we all know what they are. If you get away from that stuff and get back to like basic kind of common sense ideas about like, what we need, if we want more people to come downtown, we need to beautify downtown. So let's all get together and paint the curbs, which is what they did in Portsmouth.
Yeah.
Let's bring people downtown to skate, which hasn't happened in 4 decades. People don't know how to ice skate anymore. In Portsmouth, they used to. The city used to spray water on a park and it would freeze and they go skate. Now you see people, there's like 5 people know how to skate. Everybody else is falling on their butts all the time. That's okay. That's okay. That's the way it should be. That's fine. Not a problem. You learn how to skate again. That's fine. A whole generation learns how to skate. That's good. But it's like that small stuff takes you away from the big issues that seem to be fodder. We stopped with cable TV news in my household. We don't have it, okay? Because it is toxic beyond words. And I urge everybody to say, no more cable TV news. You're not getting any news. You're just getting made mad, made alarmed. They're pushing your alarm button. Those people you're right, they're bad. You're right, they're bad.
And we wonder why our anxiety and our addictions are so prevalent. If you turn on the news, you immediately get anxiety and fear and division thrown right in the face.
And I think when you get down onto burns away all that stuff. The local level, burns away all that nastiness on Twitter, and the cable TV news networks and other websites and so on. You just get back to people. Hey, how you doing? Seeing somebody in a cafe. Now that you can actually go to a cafe and see people, right? And see people and hang out with people the way you used to do at Dreamland Pool, which you haven't been able to really do in any meaningful way until these cafes start up. So all of this, to me, is showing us that the way forward, these epidemics are showing us the way forward to much deeper problems that afflict us. And that's, again, not just addiction, which is pretty damn bad, not just mental illness, which is so bad, but also loneliness, depression, fragmentation, isolation, et cetera, et cetera.
Connection.
Yes, and you can do that in small ways, and it's the small ways that in fact lead to greater, more healthy solutions that don't come accompanied by unintended consequences of the kind we're still living with from all those bizarre decisions and policies and culture that we had during the opioid, the height of the opioid pain pill prescribing.
Well, if there's one thing that addiction doesn't know, it doesn't matter where you live, how much money you make, what the color of your skin is, whether you're political, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. Male,
Yeah.
female,
I-
addiction, it's something that can touch every single one of us. And it's something
Sure.
that as a parent, when I was thinking about interviewing you, I was thinking, oh my goodness, like I feel so grateful that I came from Portsmouth, Ohio. I'm really proud of that. And I sort of made it out, is what we say, because I moved on. That was one get I it's so I mean, it's terrible to say, but it's the gift that my parents, why they showed up every single day for 30 plus years to the Uranium Enrichment Corporation in Piketon. It was the gift that they gave myself and my sisters to get out of the small town and go make something of yourself. That was the gift they gave me. I am forever grateful for that. That's also the gift I'm trying to give my own children. And it's also the reality that it doesn't matter. You don't have to live in a town like Portsmouth, Ohio. I live in a suburb, a village of Cincinnati, and it's something that I am nervous and scared about and fearful of my own children because fentanyl is so prevalent,
Yes.
methamphetamine is so prevalent, and I worry about what that looks like for my own children.
And
And
I
I
think that that's essential to because fentanyl is everywhere, because methamphetamine is so damaging to people's brains. That's why these kinds of like small, local, neighborhood-based, park-based, church-based, business-based, whatever efforts are so important. It's
yeah.
really like an essential thing now. We got to be doing this because being alone is falling prey to not just Fox News or CNN, but fentanyl and meth, which is simply, in my view, I kind of view Fox News, CNN, and way out here on the spectrum, you've got fentanyl and methamphetamine. They're all part of the same continuum. But let me leave you with this, Lindsay. One of the great moments of my writing Dreamland was when I heard about Dreamland, this pool, and I didn't know anything about it. And I was thinking, I got to find out more about it. So I was a member of a Facebook group called You're from Portsmouth if ... right? And I was by then member of it. And so I write this post on that Facebook page. Hey, I heard you all had this pool called Dreamland. I was wondering if you could let me know any, memories and that kind of thing. Oh my God, 3 days. It never stopped coming. Posts that were like this long. Oh, I lost my virginity. It's Dreamland Pool. I
Yeah.
remember the
I'm
French
getting
fries,
yeah.
A&W. I remember the radio jingle, time to turn so you won't burn. The radio station knew most of its listeners were at the swimming pool. So every half hour they'd say, you got to turn over, you're going to burn, because
Gonna
they knew
flood.
everyone was there. It was just a powerful, powerful thing. I was afraid they were going to take it down. So I copy the whole thing, put it in a separate file. And it was a beautiful reflection and mirror almost to how people had viewed how they grew up, why everybody wants this local community connection and participation, because it means something to us all. We evolved as human beings to not think it was a good thing. It is a good thing, but not just that, to think to know that it was an essential thing. It's essential to why we survived. Human connection and community. It's just that in America, in the last 40 years, we have decided we don't need this. We're prosperous enough. We don't need other people. Other people give us a pain in the neck. Oh, they're hard to deal with. They don't vote like we do. Don't belong in the same church, et cetera, et cetera. A million reasons why we don't want to be around other people. And now we can be isolated. And that is we are being killed off by our own prosperity. The ability to be able to function alone is not a good thing.
No, I agree with you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so grateful to have these moments with you and for giving this spotlight and this platform to so many other people who their families have they've lost family members or loved ones to addiction, and, to the people of Portsmouth, Ohio, and to all the small towns and communities out there for people who are currently struggling. We all are just really grateful for people like you who step out there, take these moments and make them bigger for all of us. Thank you, Sam. So
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lindsay. Good luck with your podcast. Great to be with you.
thank you, and good luck on that third book.
All right, then. Thanks a lot.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Take care. God bless.
Bye-bye.
And I just want to thank Sam once again today and all the listeners for listening to this. If you haven't had a chance, please go and educate yourself on the addiction issues that we talked about today, as well as Dreamland, The Least of Us, and possibly just a Sam Quinones. God bless. Take care of each other and take care of yourselves.
Wow. Can you hear me,
No,
Lindsay? Oh, hold on.
I can now.
Oh, okay. Okay. How do you feel?
That was hard.